Hi, everybody. This is the second lecture in Module 9. I'm going to jump to my PowerPoint. This particular lecture, as well as the third one, will be talking about enteroviruses, and I'll explain what those are in a moment. We'll do a brief overview of what enteroviruses are, but we're going to spend a lot of time talking about polio and the pathogenesis of polio. For this particular lecture, I expect that you would be able to describe the characteristics of enteroviruses, and then also be able to explain the course of a mild versus a major polio infection. We'll also talk about what post-poliomyelitis syndrome is, and then talk about the pathogenesis of poliovirus. How does it go from entering the oral cavity to actually causing these different symptoms? So with that, move on to the next one. Enteroviruses are a group of viruses that are small, naked RNA viruses. Remember, naked means that they don't have an envelope, and they are more difficult to get rid of than enveloped viruses. They are RNA viruses, which means that their genome is made up of RNA rather than DNA. Entero, so talking about what that prefix to enteroviruses means intestines. And so these types of viruses are transmitted through what is called the oral fecal route, meaning that you ingest something or the virus enters through the mouth and it exits, its portal of exit would be through the feces. And generally we have contamination of water or food or something that gets it back into that oral cavity. There are over 70 different human enteroviruses and 20 recognizable that are associated with infectious diseases. One of the ones that has the most studies done is poliovirus, and we're going to talk primarily about that with just a little bit of an inclusion of the other enteroviruses in the next lecture. So the history of polio, we saw outbreaks in Northern Europe in the 1800s, and when we really started to see it in the United States was in the 1900s. So New York City had an epidemic in 1916, and it was one of the worst in history. We saw 600 people dying from polio and around 27,000 that were actually paralyzed. And we'll talk about how it is that this virus can cause paralysis of the body. By the 1940s, there was development of the polio pathway the polio vaccine underway. So people were trying to figure out a way to prevent the spread of this. So why was it such a big public concern? It was a disease that we found to be mysterious, and it was also had a seasonal appearance. Typically, we saw surges in the summer, which is not typically what we would see with most viruses. But this was often caused by its spread through public pools, and we'll kind of talk about that as we move through. It also had this horrifying symptom in kind of a small percentage, but a large enough number of patients that it could paralyze the respiratory muscles, which meant people who had the part that paralyzed their respiratory muscles, if they didn't get some sort of treatment, which we'll talk about the main way that people were treated for this, they would die because they would not be able to do inhalation and exhalation. It also had disfiguring and crippling effects. So we see with post-poliomyelitis, lots of people have one limb that's smaller, maybe a limp. We'll talk about that. And sometimes it had fatal effects. Obviously, if you had those paralyzed respiratory muscles and no way to treat it, people didn't survive that. So the clinical features of poliomyelitis, the mouth is the portal of entry, as I said. It's generally an oral fecal, although periodically, we would see an oral to oral, meaning somebody infected with it could spread it, but it would need to be direct contact. One of the ways that we saw it spread really efficiently was infants in diapers, especially infants that were in diapers in like pools, where that fecal matter could be spread in a pool. It had a very long, or has a very long incubation period. So from the time of exposure until you have symptoms, it could be anywhere from 6 to 20 days, so almost up to 3 weeks. And what we know is that it's present in the human feces for a very long period of time, which means it can be spreading during that time. So you could be infected with it and actually have the virus in your feces for 3 to 6 weeks. The interesting thing about this is that for most people, it's a mild infection. As a matter of fact, 95% of all the polio virus infections are asymptomatic. So 95% of the people who are infected with it have no symptoms. The problem is that those asymptomatic persons can shed the virus in their feces and are able to transmit it to others. So we could see that this would be transmitted quite readily amongst many, many people. If you have no symptoms, you don't know that you should be being careful, right? About 4 to 8% of those polioviruses, the infections caused mild symptoms. So again, out of all the people who were infected, what we would see is between 4 and 8% would have something that we would say is kind of a mild symptom. And it was kind of non-specific. So malaise, so feeling kind of tired, GI disturbances, so you might have some diarrhea or some cramping, fever and flu-like illness, and sore throat. Generally speaking, what we saw with mild infections is that complete recovery could occur within a week. So many people had this thinking they had kind of a slight cold and then thought they were fine when they were still able to infect other people. With that, we know that in 1 to 2% of those infected people, there could be minor illness that's followed by a stiffness in the neck, back, and or legs. And this, again, would still be part of the mild infection, and we could have symptoms that might persist 2 to 10 days before completely recovering. But in mild infection, we expect this kind of complete recovery. And again, this was a small percentage of all the people infected just had mild, but all of the people could still be spreading it. Now, with major illness, which is kind of what gets all of the news and is what was really terrifying about this, was that in about 1% to just under that of all the poliovirus infections, we would see paralysis. And the paralysis could be the shoulder muscles, the muscles in the arms and legs. They could be even within the hands and the hip. And all of these would be ways that we would see kind of these symptoms of what we would call major illness. We would see also, if we looked inside the body, that there's inflammation and destruction of the neurons, or those nerve fibers that are taking a message from the brain out to the body and from the body back to the brain. If you suffered from a major illness from poliovirus infection, typically we saw recovery would take up to 2 years, and for some people, they never recovered. So the 3 types of major illness that we saw, and again, remember, this is having to do with paralysis, were either spinal, and this meant that you had asymmetrical, meaning that you had paralysis either on your left or your right-hand side, or maybe you had bulbar, which meant that you had muscle weakness. And in this case, often we saw an inability to talk or to swallow. And this also affected the respiratory system. Many of these patients required what we called an iron lung, basically this machine that allowed them to inhale and exhale, where the machine did the work for them. And then some people had a combination of the two, meaning that they had asymmetrical paralysis along with this problem with the respiratory system. This is showing what the iron lung looked like. I'm sure many of you have seen pictures, and I know I put a video up for this particular module that talks about the iron lung. But this is basically what it looked like. The person would be basically everything inside of the iron lung except for their head, and then it would be sealed so that air, basically the pressure within the iron lung remained, and the iron lung would actually make it so that the lungs would inhale, so expand and bring in air, and then exhale. But it was all through the use of this iron lung. The person was not actually doing the breathing on their own. So those were kind of the ways that we see it as an acute illness, if you will. So kind of this minor or this major illness. But what we now know about it is it's one that we see symptoms or a syndrome that followed it after the infection was resolved. So in a large proportion of those individuals who recover from the paralytic poliomyelitis, and poliomyelitis, I'm going to go to my whiteboard just to kind of give you an idea of what that means. See if I can bring that up. So with poliomyelitis, that term, you'll see this a lot. Polio, let's see. poliomyelitis. So polio refers to the polio virus. And myelitis, this refers to the myelin sheaths. And these are kind of like collars that go around your nerves. So myelin sheaths surrounding the nerves. And what we would see is that if you have an itis, refers to inflammation. So when you have inflammation of these sheaths, basically these collars that surround our nerves, what poliomyelitis did was it damaged and in many cases destroyed the nerves themselves. So what we saw with this post-poliomyelitis syndrome, and again, basically after the destruction of some of these nerves, is we saw this syndrome that often will follow people for their entire life. So I'll go back to the slides and go over what we would see. So as I said, this occurred in a large proportion of those individuals who recovered from that paralytic poliomyelitis. But usually what we saw was 15 and even up to 70 years later, we would have 70 years after their infection, we would see some symptoms. And this tended to be more common in women than men. We're not sure why that is. But the most common symptoms that we see is new weakness in those same muscles that were originally involved or originally paralyzed. We see fatigue in those muscles as well, and often pain in the muscles and joints. And for those of you who maybe don't know anybody who ever suffered from polio, I know that friends of my parents that I know, they actually have one leg that's smaller. It didn't develop properly because the nerves in that particular leg were damaged when they had paralytic poliomyelitis, and they're living with it as a lifelong kind of disability. They're in their 60s and 70s now, and will always have some issues with those. So it's one of those ones that we think of as, even though you may recover from it, you could still have a syndrome years down the road. So the exact cause of this, of why this comes in later, is unclear, but most thought is that those motor neurons that were infected with the poliovirus over time get worse or degenerate, and eventually they die. So that may take years after the initial infection. Right now, the best management that can be done is to manage the pain and fatigue. So often they'll be given painkillers, try to deal with the fatigue. And then usually there's a lot of physical and occupational therapy. Keeping active is one of those things that we know keeps the muscles at least somewhat working better and hopefully keeps the person moving for longer. So just to kind of give you a little bit of background when we think about the poliovirus, this is a member of what is called the Picornaviridae family. It has an icosahedral shaped capsid. Remember, that's kind of that polygon shaped. And it is non-enveloped. And hopefully you remember that non-enveloped actually can resist environmental factors better than enveloped ones. In addition, it's something that we say is acid stable, meaning that a lot of times, even with acid present around it or acidic environments, it survives that. And so that can be a real, that's one of the reasons why, as we think about it in the oral cavity, which tends to be fairly acidic, it actually can remain active. It is a positive sense single-stranded RNA genome, which means it's ready to be translated into proteins immediately. So as I said, the stability of enteroviruses in the environment, they have this ability to be resistant to many things. And again, they're not enveloped, which makes them a little bit hardier of a virus. So one of the things I said is that they can withstand acidic conditions. So even pHs that are lower than 3, we think of a pH of 7 as being neutral. So this would be quite acidic. They can resist digestion by most proteases. So often the human body will produce proteases that would be found in the oral cavity. They can actually be resistant to that. Detergent, so when we think of washing our hands and that can damage things like the coronavirus, it doesn't affect the poliovirus. Even 70% alcohol, these viruses are immune to that or are resistant. Other lipid solvents, again, also can't inactivate this particular virus. And many of the disinfectants that we would think about using are not very good against enteroviruses. The other thing that we know is that it can be stable for several days to even several weeks at a cold temperature. So 4 degrees Celsius would be what you would think of as kind of the refrigerator. So they can actually maintain, and actually that's a way that they could be stored and remain active. So how do we inactivate them? What are the ways that we can actually deal with them? One of the ways that we can is through chlorine or bleach. And that's a big one when I said that this often was spread through swimming pools. Adding chlorine and having higher levels of chlorine can inactivate it. Hydrochloric acid. So although this is something that enters through the oral cavity, generally speaking, the hydrochloric acid in our stomach would kill off some of it, although we would see that the virus, as it continues to replicate, can be shed then in the feces. Aldehydes, which are a chemical that we often use as a disinfectant, those are ones that would be helpful. And then if we do heat up to 50 degrees Celsius, that's pretty hot in Fahrenheit for 1 hour, what we would see is that that can inactivate it as well. So one of the ways that we diagnose most enteroviruses, but especially or specifically polio, is that we can do stool samples. We can also do cell culturing or blood testing, but the stool sample is generally the way that it is diagnosed. So how is it that it causes this kind of horrible disease in some people? As I said, this is a very small percentage, but we know that with its ability to spread, it could be a large number of people, which means even though it might be just 1%, if you have thousands that are infected, we would expect to see then a large number of people that would be ill from it. So humans and non-human primates are the only known natural host of it. It's likely because other organisms don't have a receptor that's specific for poliovirus. And we've tested it on many experimental animals, trying to see if we can have an animal model, and they're all resistant to the virus. So this is something that we see as specifically for humans and non-human primates. Once it's ingested, remember I said that it is this fecal contamination. So whether that's water or food, the poliovirus then can invade what is called the lymphoid tissues. So we have areas in the body that have lots of our immune cells, and poliovirus actually can get into those areas. So one of the places we see is the Peyer's patch. Peyer's patch is around the abdominal, the kind of higher part of the gastrointestinal tract, and it can also get through the tonsils, which are at the back of your throat. When it moves into these 2 lymphoid tissues, it can then enter the bloodstream. And in a very small percentage of the infected, it will enter the central nervous system, and that's where we see that paralytic polio syndrome. So with that, I think I have a figure that shows this. So again, the poliovirus would enter through that ingestion, and it could replicate either in the tonsils, which are at the back of the throat, or down in the Peyer's patch, which is near kind of the top of the upper, the digestive tract, or the top of the small intestine. When it enters into either the Peyer's patch or the tonsils, it can enter the blood at this point, and this would be where we would have primary viremia circulation, so it would cause an infection throughout the blood system. What we do know is that in some cases, and again, that's usually less than 1%, we can get this secondary viremia where it goes to other target issues. And so that can be polio in the brain, which can cause encephalitis and paralysis, or polio in the meninges, which is the what goes around the spinal cord and the brain, and this can cause meningitis. And that's where we would really tend to see these paralytic issues, is if it makes it into that secondary viremic target tissue. With that, we have a checking in. Please feel free to pause the video and write down the answers before you come back and go through it with me. So let's go ahead and do the checking in. Are enteroviruses DNA or RNA viruses? They're RNA viruses, and keep in mind also they're naked viruses, which makes them more difficult to inactivate. How is poliovirus transmitted? It's generally transmitted from the oral fecal route, although there are some cases where we've seen it transmit oral to oral. What is the difference between mild and major illness? mild, it basically looks like a mild cold for a few days. Sometimes there can be lingering fatigue or muscle achiness, but really kind of a mild cold. With major illness, this is where we tend to see paralysis. So whether that's that one side or the other of muscle paralysis, or basically the bulbous, which means that it's incorporated kind of the respiratory system and often can cause the shutdown of the respiratory system. What is post-poliomyelitis syndrome? This is a syndrome that occurs usually years after that illness or that paralytic poliomyelitis. And typically what we see here is weakness and pain and fatigue, often smaller limbs in those areas that were originally infected. And this can take decades for this to develop. Name at least one, sorry, I didn't put in the one, name at least one environmental factor that the poliovirus is resistant to. We know that it's resistant to acid or acidic conditions. It's resistant to cool temperatures. It's resistant to many of the detergents that we would use, many different chemicals that it's resistant to as well that affect lipids. What organs are the initial site for the poliovirus to enter the bloodstream? There's two lymphoid tissues that we think of as the tonsils and the Peyer's patch. Hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask me. Thanks.